Welcome to today's webinar on renewable energy in Latin America. I'm Cindy Arnson, the director of the Latin American program at the Wilson Center, and I'm delighted to be partnering today with CEDA, the Chilean Renewable Energy Association, in sponsoring this event. In September last year, in advance of the global summit on climate change known as COP25, 9 Latin American countries made a pledge to have 70% of their energy needs come from renewable sources by the year 2030. This is almost double what the European Union is planning. Not all renewables are equal, however. Hydropower, for example, raises a host of environmental and social issues linked to water use, the construction of dams, and vulnerability to droughts. But now, as COVID-19 is wreaking havoc on economies throughout the region, the renewable energy sector may provide actually a unique opportunity, a sort of virtuous trifecta to attract foreign direct investment, to create jobs in the formal sector through the use of technology, and to reduce the region's carbon footprint in order to mitigate climate change. This is especially true given that the costs of clean energy have declined dramatically in recent years. In the Latin American region, Chile and Uruguay have made tremendous strides in developing their renewable energy capabilities. In 2016, for example, Uruguay had the 3rd highest rate of investment in renewables in the entire world. And Chile, with the vast Atacama Desert in the north, has been a leader in transforming its energy grid to solar power. Argentina, by contrast, generates a relatively low percentage of its energy from renewable sources, but the country invested heavily in developing the sector in recent years. In fact, Forbes magazine said just a few months ago that Argentina may be the hottest renewable energy market you've never heard of. We're joined today by some of the architects of Latin America's renewable energy transformation, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. First is Ariel Yepes Garcia, who is chief of the energy division of the Inter-American Development Bank. Then Sebastián Kind, who is CEO and chair of Remap, is the former Undersecretary for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency in Argentina. Next, Marta Jara is the former president in Uruguay of ANCAP, the Uruguayan National Administration for Fuel, Alcohol, and Cement. And last but not least, Carlos Finat, the executive director of the Chilean Renewable Energy Association, CEDA. If you'd like to join in this conversation, those who are joining us on the webcast, please send us a tweet to @LATAMPROG, LATAMPROG, and I'll be happy to direct your question to one of our panelists. Ariel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cynthia. Good morning, and thanks to the Wilson Center for inviting me to talk about renewable energy in Latin America and the Caribbean. I will share my screen, my presentation. I wonder if you can see it now. And here, what I will try to share with you is some of the outlook of the renewable energy in the whole region. Basically, what we have seen in the former years is that on average, in the last 10 years, renewable energy, including hydro generation and non-conventional renewable energy, represents about between 50 and 60% of the total generation in Latin America and the Caribbean. That is the highest rate of renewable energy at the level of a specific region in the whole world. That's why at the Inter-American Development Bank, we say that Latin America, to some extent, is a green region when we talk about renewable energy. What you can see in this chart is how important is renewable energy for the different countries across the region. Basically, 4 countries, Paraguay, Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Brazil, and Colombia as well, have a share of renewable energy of more than 80%. In blue, it is the hydro generation. In yellow is the generation with non-conventional renewable energy. That is geothermal, photovoltaic and wind generation. And something interesting that is happening in Central America is basically those countries in Central America are the ones with the largest share of non-conventional renewable energy. That is an important element to take into account. Now, this is a chart of what do we think at the Inter-American Development Bank that will happen with the demand of electricity in the coming years from 2020 up to 2040. Basically, the conclusion in this analysis, and this is good information that we got from the different countries, is that electricity will increase and it will double basically in the coming 20 years. And the share of renewable energy is going to be important, particularly non-conventional renewable energy. Now, to make that happen, it is important to think and to wonder if you will have the potential to have all that generation with wind and solar particularly, if prices are going to be competitive, and also a third element that depends a lot on the governments, if we have the right institutions and the appropriate regulations. First of all, in the case of the potential, what we have is the wind and solar resource potential in Latin America is vast, is huge. In the left map, what you can see is the potential for wind generation. And what we see that most of this potential is concentrated in the South Cone. And when we talk about solar potential, is more evenly distributed across the whole region. I want to highlight that when we did this analysis to identify the potential for both, basically two countries, Argentina and Brazil, are the ones with the largest potential for wind generation. And for solar generation are Brazil, Chile, and Mexico. According to the analysis that we prepared at the bank, if we compare the total installed capacity in Latin America in 2020, that is about 419 gigawatts, the total wind potential is 15 times that capacity. And the solar potential is 35 times the current capacity available. So that means that the potential for both wind and solar generation is vast in the region. What about the competitiveness? In this chart, what you can see is from 2013 up to 2017 is the drop in prices for different auctions that we have in the region. We have very successful auctions in Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and Chile particularly, that we know and we are quite sure that if we keep that tendency in the years to come, renewable energy is going to be very competitive. And we have a very recent experience. A few months ago, we had an auction, a very successful auction in Colombia, that we got clear that the tendency is there, and we are sure that we will get that drop in prices in the years to come. This chart showcases what has happened in the last 10 years with the prices, the average prices for the different technologies that we have for non-conventional renewable energy. In blue, it is wind generation. In yellow is solar photovoltaic generation. And in pink is the battery storage cost. For all of them, the tendency is declining. So that is good news about the competitiveness of these technologies, and that is around the world. Now, what we could say about the different perspectives that we have in the years to come to diversify the energy matrix in the whole region. According to an analysis prepared by Bloomberg, which is totally consistent with the one that I showed you in my second slide, this is what may happen with the demand of electricity in the years to come. And this is the composition, the potential composition that we may have with different sources of generation. And in yellow, what you see is the potential for solar photovoltaic generation in the years to come. And in blue is the wind generation. What we see in here, and it is basically, as I said, what the conclusions that we have for our analysis, is that the composition of the generation matrix for the years to come in the whole region in Latin America and the Caribbean has very good prospects for non-conventional renewable energy, being solar generation the most important and the one with the highest potential, considering the availability in the region, and the cost. But it is not only having a potential for these different sources, it is not only about talking about competitiveness, it is also important to think about having the right institutions and regulations. If we don't have the right institutions and regulations, it's going to be difficult to have private sector participation. So these are my conclusions for what we think that is going to happen, and it is necessary to happen in the years to come in the region to enable all the investments in renewable energy. It is fundamental to speed up regulatory framework transformation for competitive private sector participation. It is critical to facilitate options for renewable, distributed generation, and battery storage. That is going to be the revolution in the years to come. And to take utilities to the future with more renewable energy participation, increase competition, especially depending on the scale of the technology that we use for photovoltaic generation particularly. And also perhaps something that is going to be very relevant in the months to come is capturing secondary effects of the stimulus packages being launched elsewhere, particularly in Europe. And we think and we expect that something like that happened in Latin America, and we are eager to see some proposals from different countries. Thank you, Cynthia.
Ariel, thanks very much. Sebastian, you're next.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cynthia. It's truly a great honor for me to be here. I'm extremely grateful. Let me please share my screen as well. I have a brief presentation speaking on the Argentinian case. I hope you can see me. Okay, so basically what we started a few years ago in a country that was immersed in a deep problem, economic problem, and with a deep energy crisis as well. So we started understanding what was that problem to solve in order to really deploy renewable energy, and what was also the potential impact that we has as a country full of resources, as you know, and as perfectly Ariel previously described. So basically, renewables are not growing fast enough in developing countries, mainly in countries like Argentina or many others, in which we find a lot of fiscal and political problems. So this is due to real and perceived risk to the long-term investment that includes change of rules over PPA duration. Imagine that 20 years PPA means 5 administrations in a country that is sometimes, you know, used to change the rules within the same administration or even every year. So we also suffer about off-taker delays or non-payments, local currency inconvertibility, intransferability, weak or non-trusted local law enforcement, sovereign default, etc., etc. So what we designed was something that was in favor of taking the program of renewable energy out of the country risk, out of the Argentinian risk, and shifting this towards a AAA market, although we are not a AAA market. By doing this, what we could do was basically to lower actual and perceived risk, improving the credit rating, and improves the economics and competition, resulting in lowering the energy prices. This is to say that the proper implementation of a de-risking mechanism has the relevant impact on the price of renewable energy, boosting its development. So basically, we've done this through a multi-level credit enhancement approach based on 4 stages, starting with the off-taker responsibility and commitment. This is what I call the worst-case scenario cascade or waterfall, in which we jump from one step into the next one up to the 4th step, in which we brought a AAA warranty to backstop the obligation of the sovereign warranty. Basically, what we are saying here is that we started with the off-taker commitment, and we jump out of the off-taker commitment into the sovereign commitment into the sovereign risk, in order to shield this program out of the off-taker and out of the country problem or fiscal or any political problem that we may see, bringing a powerful set of warranties that make this shifting that we are talking about. So what are the results of these auctions? In Argentina, we offer the first round of Renewal 1,000 megawatts. We received more than 6 times oversubscription. We offer in a second round 1.2 gigawatts, and we received more than 8 times oversubscription. So that was quite impressive results that finished in more than 240 projects awarded. Up to 30 months for reaching the COD, so the commercial operation, and more than 6.3 gigawatts of new power have been awarded. So today what we have in Argentina is a list of 156 projects, either in commercial operation or under construction. You can see here the number of projects that are already commissioned and the number of projects that are under construction today. So we brought to the country more than $7.4 billion in roughly 2 years' time for a total capacity of extra 5 gigawatts. It is interesting, but at the same time, we were able to develop the industry itself with 9 factories installed in the country. So 2 main wind turbine manufacturers have installed facilities, Vestas and Nordex Acciona, tower factories, trackers factories, and so on, totalizing a number of 11,000, so 9,000 current jobs plus 2,000 in the industry. So where the capital come from to a country that is, as you know, quite hostile in terms of investment and the investment environment that we are here in Argentina. These $7.4 billion are coming from, I would say, all over. So Argentina has $2.3 billion, but also China, Japan, Italy, Netherlands, Brazil, Norway, Germany, so on. Money capital from multilateral institutions like IDB. So Ariel knows very well this program. He has participated in Renewal years ago, IFC, CAF, and so on. So as you see, the capital are coming to Argentina from all over, and that was a very interesting surprise to receive non-project records long-term. For a long time in the country, we didn't have these kind of financial structures. So we are very proud and happy for receiving that. So what is Remap and what we are doing? Remap is a non-profit institution that is based in Brussels. Our goal is to scale renewable energy investment in developing countries at lower cost and in a timely manner by helping governments lower long-term investment risk and improve policy implementation. It is inspired in Renewal. What we are doing is building a platform in order to help governments to commit to their clear and stable rules. Of course, it is a need for doing that in order to properly allocate the risk among the stakeholders, using effective enhancement tools in order to reach this transparent and competitive tender process for more cheap and renewable electricity. We are building a multi-layer platform with something that we call G-Tender, long-term PPAs, a toolkit, and a proper trust in which we will allocate most of the credit enhancement tools and warranties that I have described, everything secured by a blockchain application, and in which we will incorporate data science for presenting good results. So I will be delighted to share with you more details on this in a future webinar. The most important here is to help, as I said, governments of emerging economies to develop their own strategies in a proper manner. I'm, as many other colleagues, are convinced that the future of energy is electric and the future of electricity is renewable. So we are here for that. Thank you very much.
Sebastian, thanks very much. Marta from Uruguay, please go ahead.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you very much. I'm honored to be sitting on this panel, and thank everyone for joining as well. So I'd like to start by describing where we are today in Uruguay. Uruguay started a transformation, a very deep one, of its energy sector a decade ago. And today we have 98% renewables for electricity generation. I repeat 98% because some people find it hard to believe. At the beginning, it was just hydro and thermal. And over the decade, Uruguay has added capacity, increasing energy production by some 50%, basically increasing the share of wind, solar, and biomass, starting from scratch. So I think it's been a tremendous journey. Of course, power generation is one part of the equation. The rest, if you look at the overall use of primary energy, we still have 40% of oil dependence, basically, for transport, for the transport sector. And that is a big opportunity, especially if you think about the excess capacity that the system structurally has because of its heavy share of renewables. We become exporters of energy, and we also have curtailments, of course. So there lies the opportunity for what can come next. So I think it's important to ask ourselves or to share how we got there, right? So in the first place, of course, Uruguay is not cursed by the endowment of natural hydrocarbon resources, and in a way that naturally lowers the barrier to entry for renewables. So as Hydra was capped, the historic investments in Hydra were capped, the exposure to oil started to increase, and the supply bill, the oil bill, became costly and more volatile, and that in a way provided good fundamentals to shift to renewables. I'm sure in this webinar, most of the people know that strong fundamentals are not enough for steering good policy. There needs to be, a political will that drives it. And I think this is probably the most important success factor of the transition, is that there was a state policy with full parliamentary backing that drew this plan to start this energy transition. This you have to add to the stability of Uruguay and other macroeconomic factors that made a good investment climate, okay? So in the process, Uruguay became investment grade. There are laws for the promotion and protection of investment. Foreign investors enjoy same treatment as nationals, and there are tax breaks for clean production, for creation of jobs. This all adds to the attractiveness of renewables, and also the availability of financing. I think that's important. There was the whole option of banking, multilateral infrastructure funds, pension funds, and even I'd like to mention one sort of little experiment, if you like, but I think it's important to tap into the local market. One of the last wind farms that were sponsored by the state utility opened up equity for very small investors, tranches up to $2,000. Can you imagine? So I think this is interesting in order to start developing markets and garnering public support. So what's next? I fully agree with Sebastian. The future is electric. So electrification of transport is the next big opportunity. In terms of battery electric vehicles, policy is there, and the journey has started. Uruguay opened in 2017 the first electric route across the country, from Colonia to Punta del Este. And now, I mean, you can tour the country with your electric car and you'll find your charging spots. But this is just for urban. Public transport, bus fleets in Montevideo are starting to migrate to electric. So I'm very confident that that is happening on the battery side. I see a huge surge in hydrogen. We're seeing the Green Deal in Europe. People start talking about scale, accelerated deployment. It's a technology that's not yet fully mature, but there's been also talk by Ariel about the need for storage of energy that's generated by renewables. Hydrogen is a fantastic opportunity for that. And I have to say, it's not an explicit building block of the energy policy of 2010. Of course, it would have been extremely disruptive to include such a thing then. But under the previous administration, the state-owned companies and the government started to work on a pilot. And I think it's a big opportunity, not only for Uruguay, but for the whole continent. We have, bulk freights that need to be transported over long distances, mining activities, agricultural activities. All these uses are well suited for hydrogen as a vector. And of course, the new government needs to take stock, revisit priorities, and so forth. But I'd like to mention one specific step taken that I think it's interesting on several aspects. But the president already signed a decree for cooperation on hydrogen with JBIC, the Japanese Bank for International Cooperation. And I mention this not just because of what it may mean in terms of continuity, but because in my mind, it's a very strong evidence of how I've been part of the process when the Japanese who tabled this initiative, it didn't come from an energy counterpart, it came from the financing sector. So I think it's a very clear evidence that the capital allocation processes are really pushing for clean energy. All the incorporation of SEG aspects in the capital allocation processes, I think it's gonna be a big boost, and especially after COVID-19. So all of this has been sort of the standard pitch of 2019, January 2020, February 2020, and then in March, the pandemic sets in, and what has changed? I think this is a little bit the question you put out to us, Cindy. And basically, many of the issues that drive for clean energy were there, are underlying issues. We've been talking about them for some time, and we've started the transition. But as in many other aspects, I think this pandemic, it's like a sobering shock that says, okay, many of these to-do things need to happen. Let's face it, or it's going to hit us. Climate change is going to hit us big time. We need to be proactive. So in the interest of time, and I know we're going to have time for questions, let me just touch upon the headlines of what I think are these key issues that we need to, take even more seriously. So one is volatility. You all know what's happening with oil markets, and we look up to Chile really for the way they manage volatility in a good way. Governance has a lot to do with it. Oil price. If you ask people around what they remember about 2008, most people would say the financial crisis. I'm in the energy sector. For me, if I think back at 2008, I think the start of the oil price rally. And we're seeing similar dynamics today, investments drying up because cash flows are not there by oil companies to invest enough to sustain production if demand rebounds to normal levels. So the supply-demand balance can very easily turn to some scarcity, and this will drive prices up. So if we are assessing and deciding on investments on renewables, we cannot stay comfortably anchored in this low price scenario. We need to think more strategically and think that a high oil price scenario can come in the medium term. Liabilities. Every technology that's phased out, like fossil fuels, leaves liabilities behind. If we are not proactive starting today, we're going to be faced at some point with not having sufficient funds for environmental cleanup costs and for labor liabilities. Many of these state-owned companies have strong workforces, rigid workforces with tenure basically for life. So we need to start managing all these aspects, upskilling people and delivering the new competencies that will be needed for clean energy jobs. And then competitiveness. So being able to separate cost from all the fiscal elements, including subsidies. This is the time to cut fossil subsidies because of the low oil prices, but we need to improve the governance in order to be able to make sure we can have good analysis, because energy has not only to be clean, it needs to be affordable as well. My country in particular has an issue with competitiveness, and it's important, of course. And last but not least, all the stimulus packages we are seeing around the world, and for instance, the International Energy Agency is extremely vocal about this. All these stimulus packages, much of that money is going to end up, for instance, in the construction sector, right? And if we're talking about renewables, there's something that beats renewables, and it's energy efficiency. That's the cheapest energy, the one you don't consume at all. And whatever we build today is going to lock up the energy system for the next decades in terms of a consumption pattern. So I think it's the time, again, to think very responsibly about setting these standards, because that is the other part of the equation for a clean energy transition. Thank you, Cindy.
Marta, thanks so much. We finally turn to Carlos Finat. Thank you again, Carlos, for ACERA's co-sponsorship of today's event.
Thank you very much, Cindy, and thank you to the Wilson Center for this invitation. I am really honored by being here. Just to give a brief overview about how the energy matrix of Chile, I would say that about 25% of our installed capacity today comes from non-conventional renewable energies. That is renewable energies, but without the large hydro capacity, which is accounted separately. It is for the people that hear us outside from Chile, this is similar in terms of size of the system to the state of Kentucky in the States. As you may see in this chart also, you can see that Chile has a pretty well diversified energy matrix. We still rely on a high percentage on coal. We'll refer later about this, some part on natural gas, and then water, solar, and wind energy. Common comment about Chile is that Chile is a solar paradise, but you must also have into account that compared with the capacity of solar that is installed, wind is 60%. So wind and solar are very important for our energy production. In terms of capacity installed from non-conventional renewable energies, we already have about 6 gigawatts of installed power. So these numbers are at the end of May, but in this month, we already have commissioned other power plants. But what is more important is that we have about 700 megawatts of power plants under commissioning process, and 5 additional gigawatts that are under construction and that should be commissioned from the rest of 2020 and the next year. So we expect that about the end of this decade, we should have about 60 to 70% of the total energy that is produced in Chile, total electric energy that is produced in Chile, coming from renewable energies, both from large hydro and non-conventional energies. The main driver for this has been that Chile has an open economy, so everybody can come here, invest, and proceed with the project. A strong signal that was sent some years ago in terms of the risking solar and wind generators, that is allowing them to sell energy to regulated customers by hourly blocks, a demand that was growing about 3–4%, of course, because before the pandemic, the low prices that were shown in the public tenders for distribution companies, where the last prices were about $32 per megawatt hour. And another one is, it's nice to be green when prices are low. I say that because of many companies that have been buying energy from coal. Once wind and solar became less expensive, they discovered that they were also green. That's nice. It's okay. We had preferred that those companies should have contract energy because the energy was clean. And the other process is that the country under public-private agreement is retiring the coal-based generation. Chile has about 5 gigawatts of coal-based generating units, and so far about 800 megawatts have already been retired, and from here to 2024, about 1.9 gigawatts should be retired, with the rest to be retired up to 2040, and probably will be before this date due to the public pressure on coal-based generation. Of course, we have the impact of the pandemic. That means lower power demand has decreased about 10% so far. Probably will be reduced even more. The delay on tenders, also public and private, the delay on investment of merchant plants, some provisional, and I agree with Marta that fossil fuels will be competitive perhaps for 1 year or 2 years, but in the long term, nobody is thinking to invest in new coal or even in LNG-based generation. And the last, the false dilemma of economic recovery or sustainability. We hear this, and this is part of the policy of the government, and we expect that the government will remain firm in terms that climate change has not been stopped by the pandemic, and we need to be in the way of decarbonizing the industry. But anyway, the matter is discussed sometimes. Some downsides of the view from the regulatory and the economic side is there is tendency of the government, and it seems it has in other countries, to transfer to companies the cost of some of the social measures that are taken to mitigate the effects of the crisis in the people that has few resources. This already was implemented last year, and actually was not implemented by the pandemic. It was implemented by a social explosion that we had in October last year. But in the same line, other measures are being taken that also allocate the cost to private companies. This is not the way to do, of course, good regulation. We're absolutely opposed to this kind of measures. Transmission capacity is a growing barrier for new renewable energy plants. This is a thing that already occurs in many countries. Here is becoming critical, especially for those plants that may be online by 2024 and later. And there's an uncertainty on when some key regulation of the sector will be in effect. We see that the dates that have been informed keep sliding, and really that makes a context of lack of certainty that is new for Chile, really. And it's not really a big concern at this moment, but it should be corrected because if not, we're going to lose this is big advantage of being a very stable country in this market. Upside is climate change framework law is being discussed, and the goal of this law is to have a zero net emissions for the country by 2050. It's totally feasible, and we expect that this law will become a country law by the end of this year. Well, I already mentioned the retirement of coal-fired plants. It means to replace 5 gigawatts that should be replaced by renewable energies, mostly solar and wind. Another important regulations are already being discussed about the system flexibility that is required to operate large amounts of solar and wind energy, energy storage, and of course, hydrogen is the next step. A couple of weeks ago, the country started to, through the Minister of Energy, started to develop a roadmap for the hydrogen strategy for Chile, and we expect that having an offer of large amounts of renewable clean energy at low cost would be a competitive advantage for the country. And having said that, I think that the most important thing is that we can get an advantage for this terrible crisis that is costing so much socially to families and for the economy. And that's the sustainable recovery. I think that this is the matter that we need to discuss. We can get advantage both from other countries' programs, but in our countries is the way to say, okay, you need help to support your industry. Okay, do the things right and get greener, get a commitment on getting greener. And this is really a big opportunity. All the countries have recovery package, more or less. They can be oriented to get a sustainable recovery. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks to all of you for these great presentations. I have a number of questions. I'd like to remind people, if you're watching the webcast and you have a question, please send it via a tweet to @LATAMPROG, LATAMPROG. My first question is for Sebastián, and it has to do with the continuity between the Macri administration that you worked for and the Fernandez administration, which is obviously in the financial difficulties that we know about. First of all, if these policies that you have, that you initiated, whether those are continuing, and also if you could talk a little bit about the balance between the renewable sector in Argentina and the huge emphasis on vaca muerta, which is of course traditional oil and gas. So Sebastián, first question for you.
Yes, thank you, Cindy, very much. Well, the first is to say that the continuity of renewable energy in Argentina is something difficult to understand sometimes, but at the same time, we have to go back to 2015 when we created the National Law for Renewable Energy. It was done in the previous government to the Macri administration, and that was passed by and enacted by almost unanimity in the Congress. So pretty much all of the political parties voted on favor, 94% and 93% in both chambers. So that means that renewables is a true decision in Argentina, no matter who is in power, but we are suffering about a lot of things today with this pandemic and with many different things like lack of infrastructure in terms of grid infrastructure and different things. So things that have happened in the last 4 years are in place. A lot of investment is under construction today. So these more than 7.4 billion US dollars are happening in Argentina, in spite of the problems, the financial problems that, as you know, Argentina is going through and suffering today. So I would say that if a lot of the macro things might be adjusted, the continuity is in place because renewables are among the cheapest option in the country. And I want to link this to the second question, which is the vaca muerta question. So even in the situation of vaca muerta, in a country that has, as you know, the second worldwide reservoir of natural gas in shales, renewables are absolutely competitive. And we were in a position to demonstrate this in the past years in a country that is full of resources, but at the same time, full of constraints in terms of access to the capital market, in terms of the fiscal and political stability, and in general terms, attracting investment. So in order to deploy vaca muerta or the gas out of vaca muerta, we also need a lot of capital that the country is not in a good position to receive for different reasons, as you know. Hopefully the economic situation in Argentina will be changed, will be modified very soon, and the capital from the international capital market will flow back to the country for different kind of infrastructures. But clean energy has demonstrated to be among the cheapest option in a country that is full of resources. So I don't think that this will be stopped in a long time.
Thanks very much. The next question is for Marta. Marta, Uruguay is a small country. It has a small population, but it's not too dissimilar in size from the Central American or Caribbean countries that Ariel mentioned in his initial presentation. How could the success that Uruguay has experienced be transferred to other small economies that are suffering without any of their own national endowments of oil and gas? And has Uruguay partnered with some of these smaller markets to help them develop their industries?
So I think we have a vocation to share what we've learned, and it goes both ways, really. For instance, in the case of electrification through hydrogen, we've been to Costa Rica. Some of the teams in ANCAP have been there. They are very advanced, and they were, I think, the pioneers in Latin America for trying to deploy hydrogen based on renewables. We are interacting also at some point with Chile around regulatory frameworks and things like that. But I think in general, we could do probably a lot more in terms of integration, harnessing experiences, and so forth. OLADE, for instance, is an institution that I think they try to broker these types of knowledge and understanding, but also the private sector, people that have invested in one country, take that with them to other countries, the experience around structuring, around permitting, around business models. So that is the value add is channeled both by organizations that are for the governments, but also through the private sector itself.
Great, and a question for Carlos. Carlos, if I recall correctly, one of the many factors that spurred Chile to invest heavily in its solar capacity was a decision by the Argentine government during a previous administration to stop exporting natural gas to Chile, and therefore, it found itself dependent on an external supplier and made even more of a push to be domestically self-sustaining. What about the possibilities for an integration of the renewable energy grids, not just within one country, but between countries? Are the same fears about having a country, for a variety of reasons, prohibit the transfer or hold back, what a previous agreement had allotted? Are those some of the things that keep countries from looking to integrate their energy grids, especially in the renewable sector?
Thanks for the question, Cindy. I wouldn't say that there is an immediate relationship between the years from 2020 to 2025, when the cuts from the gas of Argentina occurred, with the development of massive development of solar and wind energy that really started by 2012, 2013. The most immediate result was that Chile built two regasification maritime terminals to get natural gas from abroad. The integration of the countries is a dream that has come from probably the 19th century, the dream from Bolivar, but it has stopped being just a dream in many markets. And so far, the electricity market has suffered the same. There's a lot of studies that demonstrate the feasibility of interconnection, but most of those studies see interconnection from the physical point of view, not from the market point of view. And the key is how we will coordinate the markets of Uruguay, Argentina, Peru, Ecuador, Chile in order to have power and energy transfer that bring value for the countries. It's not who have the lowest price, is to know and to evaluate which are the advantages of have an integrated grid. The European electricity market wouldn't be in the size and the way this is today if this would have been the criteria, just price. And today, all the studies rely on the relative prices of the country. So any country would like to sell to the other country, but not to buy. So we need to design a market that is attractive and that value things such as energy security, that is very important for the countries. And of course, there are the contractual ways to ensure that supply and the contract will be honored.
Thanks. There's a question from Lucila Arbolea, who is an analyst at IEA. I'm assuming that's the International Energy Administration. It's about the future role of hydropower in the Latin American Caribbean region and how the emphasis on that is similar to or different from the solar and wind sectors with respect to the cost of capital, the environmental risks, et cetera. And I'd like to address that question to Ariel, if I could, and perhaps ask him, as he responds, to think about the Colombian example, where, of course, some 70 or 80% of the renewable energy is from hydropower. It's been controversial. Colombia is also a major producer and consumer and exporter of coal. So if you could talk a little bit about hydro, Ariel, and reflect as well on Colombia. Thanks. Sorry, you need to unmute, Ariel, if you could start your answer again.
Yeah, sure.
There you go.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, what happens is that for hydro generation, in fact, and that was part of the presentation that I had before, according to the numbers that we got from different governments, is going to be an important element of the generation matrix in the years to come. That is going to be key. There are some complexities. That is a fundamental issue that the hydro deployment is going to face in the coming years. Definitely the more complicated or the easiest hydro projects were implemented in the past for obvious reasons. But because of that, we think that there is a huge potential for non-conventional renewable energy. And we are thinking that that potential is based in the three elements that I was discussing in my presentation. One is the potential, the other one is the competitiveness, and the other one has to do with enabling the institutional and regulatory frameworks that facilitate the implementation of these technologies. Particularly in Colombia, what we're seeing is that they are pushing forward the agenda to promote and to facilitate the adoption of non-conventional renewable energy. In fact, if you recall, last October, at the end of last October, the government had a very successful auction, and they were able to allocate more than 1.3 gigawatts in renewable, non-conventional renewable energy. And not gigawatts, gigawatts. The point in here is that a big chunk of that generation was wind. The most important one was wind, and the other one was photovoltaic. So it is clear that in the years to come, the possibilities of having additional generation, non-conventional renewable energy generation are going to something that is going to happen because of the competitiveness and because of the appetite that some countries have to diversify the energy matrix. Talking about hydro as well, we think that there is a huge potential, maybe not a lot in greenfields for hydro generation, because as I said, many of them are going to be very complex, but in the rehabilitation of the old ones that were constructed, that they were built more than 20 or 30 years ago. From our perspective, and we are about to prepare a report on the potential for rehabilitation of hydro generation in Latin America and the Caribbean. More than 30% of the total available capacity in hydro generation has to be updated in the coming 15 years. And that is a huge challenge that definitely will help to have additional capacity, because this is improving the capacity available in hydro generation without environmental harm, because those are rehabilitations.
Cindy, may I make a comment on this also? One factor that we cannot forget when talking about hydroelectricity is the climate change factor. Chile has been for more than 10 years in a deep drought. So now we are considering that this is already a structural. It's not a drought. We don't have as much water as we used to think we had. And while there are not good models that may assess how the availability of water how it will vary in the future, we need to, before making a large investment in hydro, I believe that we need to be very clear if this hydro will be available in 30 years or in 20 years. In this moment, my belief is that what we need is a more diversified matrix than to rely too much in a single technology.
Great, thanks. I have one more question, but we have about 2 or 3 minutes left. So I'd like to ask all of the panelists if they have anything that they would like to say that hasn't been covered in their initial presentation or in response to a question, if there are any burning comments. If not, I will ask one last question. Ariel or basically anybody, the IDB issued a report just last March that said that the regulations in the renewable energy sector are far from being mainstreamed, and that this jeopardizes progress towards meeting countries' sustainable development goals. And the report specifically mentions Argentina and Chile, as well as Colombia, where it talks about the need to revise regulations governing public-private partnerships, and also letting the pension funds invest in these areas. I'd like to ask both Sebastián and Carlos if they have anything in response to that observation from the IDB in terms of the regulatory framework.
Sebastián, go ahead.
Yeah, please. I think that the regulatory framework in Argentina is pretty much in place. There are different factors, but not precisely the regulatory framework, perhaps, to promote deeply the deployment of renewables or clean technology. Basically, the 6.4 gigawatts that we have awarded are pretty much covering the full capacity of the extant transmission grid, the capacity in the transmission. So in order to reach areas with interesting capacity factors as those we have in the north or deep in the south in the country, we need to build new infrastructure. And when you have to sum the cost of the infrastructure to the energy projects, you find that you have to cover thousands of kilometers with grid infrastructure, which is not cheap at all. And in order to make them competitive compared to other traditional sources, and mainly speaking and linked with the natural gas coming from Vaca Muerta, as you see this said before, it is an issue. So I think that the policy is in place. In the case of Argentina, particularly, the willingness of promoting this in a big manner or going forward to the next step of promoting renewables is key. So it is a political situation more than just a policy situation. And of course, financing as a macro thing behind everything is affecting long-term infrastructure, as you perfectly may know. So capital-intensive industries like renewables are suffering a lot when you have restrictions to the access to the capital market. So unlocking or using instruments to unlock or mechanisms to unlock the access to the capital market is key for the continuity and the promotion of the renewable energy industry.
Sebastian, thanks. We're just about out of time, but Carlos, if you'd like to make a brief comment on the regulatory framework in Chile.
Okay, thanks. No, just I agree with what Sebastian said, and we share some of the same thing. But I would like to stress the relevance of opening the possibility for the pension funds, Chilean pension funds, to invest in grid infrastructure and also in generating power plants. It's a really strange situation because some parts of the grid in Chile are owned by foreign pension funds, but the local pension funds cannot invest in this project because they have no history. This is a way that I think that will improve the financing condition as should be done in the next years.
Okay, with that, I think we're out of time. I'd like to thank all of you from joining us from Montevideo, from Santiago, from Buenos Aires, and from, I guess, Washington, D.C. or thereabouts. This webcast will be on our website. We will be producing a short summary as well as some short video clips based on today's presentation. All of those will be posted on the web as well as on our Twitter account. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you to Acera for co-sponsoring, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. With that, we're over and out. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wilson Center. Bye-bye.
Bye.